There's a town in West Virginia that doesn't want to be remembered, not because of what happened there, but because of what never happened, what was never recorded, what was deliberately erased. In 1920, the U.S. Census recorded 347 residents in Alder. 10 years later, in 1930, that number dropped to 91. But here's what keeps genealogists awake at night. There are no death certificates, no migration records, no newspaper obituaries. 256 people didn't die. They didn't leave. They were simply removed from the record, as if they never existed at all. I'm going to show you something that will change how you see your own family tree, because what happened in Alder wasn't unique. It was just sloppy. When the census takers made their rounds through Appalachian coal country in those years, they carried two ledgers. One for names that mattered, and one for names that didn't. The second ledger was never meant to survive, but in a small county archive in McDowell County, buried in a water-damaged box marked discard, someone found fragments of it, pages torn and burned at the edges, names crossed out so violently the pen tore through the paper, and beside those names in the margins a single repeating notation, NR, not recorded. What makes a person not worth recording? What makes an entire family disappear from official memory while their neighbors remain? The answer is simpler and more horrifying than you think. It wasn't about who they were. It was about who owned them. Not in the legal sense. Slavery had been abolished decades before. But in the sense that matters when you're trapped in a coal company town, when your debt exceeds your lifetime earning potential, when the land you live on, the house you sleep in, and the store you buy food from all belong to the same corporation. When you are, in every functional sense, property. And property doesn't need to be counted, it just needs to work. Until it can't. The disappeared families of Alder weren't victims of a single violent event. They were victims of something far more insidious. A systematic erasure that happened in daylight with the full cooperation of local government. And it's still happening, right now, in your family history, in the gaps you can't explain. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Let me tell you about Thomas Harlan. In the 1920 census, he's listed as head of household. Age 32, occupation coal miner, wife Mary, age 28, 5 children ranging from 2 to 12 years old. They lived on Company Row. The census taker noted they could read and write, that both adults were born in West Virginia, that the household spoke English, standard information, unremarkable, except for one thing. In the 1930 census, house number 17 on Company Row is listed as vacant, not sold, not demolished, vacant. As if the Harlan family simply stood up one morning and evaporated, I started looking for them everywhere you're supposed to look. Death records in McDowell County, nothing. Church burial registers, nothing. Migration manifests to northern cities where Appalachian families fled during the Depression, nothing. I expanded the search, changed the spelling, Harlan. Checked neighboring counties, neighboring states, nothing. 7 people do not vanish without a trace. Not in 1930, not in America. So I did what you do when official records fail. I went looking for the unofficial ones, company records, the internal documents that coal operators kept, timesheets, debt ledgers, incident reports. That's where I found him. Thomas Harlan, but not the way I expected. In the incident reports from August 1929, there's a single line entry, Harlan T. Section 4, refused work detail, disciplinary action administered. 3 weeks later, another entry, Harlan family, outstanding debt $473, wages garnished total. And then in November 1929, a final notation, Harlan household, removed per company policy, no forwarding location, removed. That's the word they used, not relocated, not evicted, removed, like you'd remove a stain, like you'd remove evidence. And here's what makes your skin crawl. Thomas Harlan's debt of $473 wasn't for luxuries. It was for food, for medical care when his daughter caught scarlet fever, for the rent on a house he could never afford to leave. The company store operated on a simple principle: keep workers in permanent debt. If you owed money, you couldn't quit, you couldn't leave. You worked until you died or until you couldn't work anymore. And if you refused, if you protested, if you tried to organize other workers, you were removed, your name struck from the ledgers, your family erased, as if you had never drawn breath on this earth. Now I need you to understand something about census records. They're not neutral documents. They never were. The census has always been a political instrument, a tool of power that decides who counts and who doesn't. In early America, enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes, but had no rights. Native Americans weren't counted at all unless they paid taxes. The census has always drawn lines around humanity, and in 1930, in places like Alder, those lines were drawn by coal companies. The census takers who went door to door weren't federal employees. They were local men hired on temporary contracts, paid per name recorded. And in coal country, the coal companies decided who got hired. They provided the maps. They determined the routes. They even provided lists of verified residents to make the process more efficient. If your name wasn't on that list, the census taker often didn't knock. He just moved on. And if you weren't home when he came by, if you were working a 16-hour shift deep underground, there was no second visit. You were simply skipped, marked as not found, or not marked at all. But the Harlan family was home. We know this because of something I found in the company store records. On the same day the census taker came through, April 7, 1930, Mary Harlan bought flour and lard on credit. The purchase was recorded at 90:00 in the morning. The census taker logged his visit to Company Row between 8:30 and 11:00 that morning. He was there, she was there. He walked past house 17 and recorded it as vacant. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't bureaucratic oversight. This was a decision, and Mary Harlan wasn't the only one. I found 37 families in Alder Run who made purchases at the company store on census day. Families who were physically present in their homes, but recorded as absent or not recorded at all. 37 families who existed in the commercial ledgers but not in the historical record. Why? Because 6 months earlier, in October 1929, there had been a work stoppage. Not a strike. The workers knew better than to call it that. Just a refusal to enter the mines until safety improvements were made after a collapse killed 4 men. The stoppage lasted 3 days. The company wrote down every name. And when the census came, those names were marked, not for recording. Here's what happens when you erase someone from the census. You don't just remove them from a single document. You remove them from history. Every genealogical database, every family tree, every historical study that relies on census data, they all conclude the same thing. These people didn't exist. Researchers looking for their ancestors hit a wall in 1930 and assumed their family line ended, died out, disappeared. They never consider that their great-grandfather was standing in his doorway when the census taker walked past. That he was alive, breathing, watching his erasure happen in real time. And the consequences compound across generations. No census record means no social security eligibility later. No proof of residence means no property claims. No documentation means no veterans benefits even if you served. The erasure in 1930 created legal ghosts. People who couldn't prove they existed, couldn't prove their children existed, couldn't access the systems that required documentation. And when those people eventually did die, often there was no official record of that either. They simply faded from living memory, leaving behind nothing but gaps, silences, the feeling among descendants that something was wrong, something was missing, but no evidence of what. I tracked down a woman named Patricia Cole, whose grandmother was one of the missing names. Patricia had been researching her family history for 20 years. She knew her grandmother Helen had lived in Alder Run. She had photographs. She had letters. She had her grandmother's wedding ring, but she couldn't find Helen in any official record between 1920 and 1940. For 2 decades, Patricia blamed herself, thought she was a bad researcher, thought she was missing something obvious. When I showed her the company records, when I showed her the notation beside her grandmother's name, and R per instruction, she didn't feel relief. She felt rage, because Helen had 5 children, all born in that 20-year gap, and without census records, without documentation, those children struggled their entire lives to prove they were citizens. One was denied a passport. Another couldn't collect his pension. Patricia's own mother was nearly denied Social Security because she couldn't produce a birth certificate. It had never been properly filed. The erasure didn't end in 1930. It echoed forward, creating bureaucratic nightmares and identity crises that lasted generations. Helen's decision to stand with her husband during that work stoppage, to support 3 days of resistance against unsafe conditions, cost her family a century of struggles. That was the punishment. Not just for her, for everyone who came after. The most disturbing thing I found wasn't in the official records or the company ledgers. It was in a diary. A census taker named William Prout kept a personal journal during his rounds in 1930. Most entries are mundane, weather observations, complaints about road conditions. But on April 7, he wrote something that made my hands shake when I read it. Skipped 17 houses today on Company Row per the list provided. Felt wrong passing them by. Could see faces in the windows, children playing in the yards. But orders are orders. The mine superintendent said these families are under company discipline, not to be counted. I wonder if they know. I wonder if they understand what's being done to them. William Prout knew. He understood he was participating in an act of historical violence. And he did it anyway. Because he needed the work. Because he had his own family to feed. Because saying no meant becoming one of the uncounted himself. This is how erasure happens. not through malice alone, but through the quiet complicity of ordinary people who understand exactly what they're doing and do it anyway because the alternative is unthinkable. Pruitt's diary reveals something we often miss in historical atrocities. The perpetrators weren't monsters. They were people making calculated decisions about their own survival. And here's what keeps me up at night. Pruitt's diary only survived because his grandson found it in an attic and didn't understand its significance. He thought it was just boring family history. He almost threw it away. How many other census takers kept similar records? How many other people documented the erasure they participated in, only for those documents to be lost or destroyed? We think of history as what gets recorded, but history is also what gets deliberately hidden, what gets burned, what gets buried, what gets dismissed as unimportant by descendants who don't recognize the weight of what they're holding. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? If you discovered your family was erased not by accident, but by design, would you want to know the truth, even if it meant confronting the fact that the people who documented history decided your ancestors didn't matter? That question isn't abstract, because if you have Appalachian roots, if your family worked in mines or mills or factories, there's a real chance you have gaps in your tree that aren't gaps at all. They're erasures. And someone, somewhere, has the records that prove your people existed. They just decided those records weren't worth preserving. I want to show you how deep this goes. In 1932, 2 years after the census, a mine explosion in Alder killed 43 men. The disaster made regional newspapers. There were investigations, inquiries. The mine was temporarily shut down. But here's the thing. When you look at the official casualty list, there are only 38 names. 43 men died. 38 were listed. 5 bodies were recovered from the deepest shaft and buried in unmarked graves in the company cemetery. No names recorded, no families notified in any official capacity, just 5 wooden crosses that rotted away within a decade. I found references to these 5 men in letters between company officials. They discussed the burial, they discussed the cost of the coffins, but they never used names, just the unmarked or the unprocessed. And in one letter, there's a chilling explanation. Given their status as undocumented workers per the 1930 protocols, formal notification would create unnecessary complications. Their absence will not be noted in official tallies. Undocumented workers in 1932 in West Virginia. These weren't immigrants. These were American citizens born on American soil, whose own government had been convinced by private corporations to treat them as if they didn't exist. The families of those 5 men knew, of course. They knew their husbands, fathers, brothers had died. They held their own services, they mourned, but they couldn't file wrongful death claims, couldn't pursue compensation, couldn't even get the mine company to acknowledge the deaths had occurred. Because without census records, without documentation, they couldn't prove the men had worked there, couldn't prove they'd existed at all. The company had created a perfect system. Erase someone from the census, and you can erase them from every legal and financial obligation that comes after, including the obligation to admit you killed them. And this wasn't limited to Alder Run. I found similar patterns in coal towns across West Virginia, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. Whole communities of workers rendered invisible, their existence acknowledged only in the private ledgers of corporations, their deaths mourned only in the memories of families who had no legal standing to demand justice. The 1930 census wasn't an anomaly. It was a tool, a weapon used to separate people into 2 categories, those who mattered and those who could be sacrificed without consequence. And the people who designed this system, who implemented it, who benefited from it, their names are recorded. Their families are documented. Their graves have headstones with carved letters that will outlast us all. So what do we do with this? How do we reckon with the fact that our historical record is full of deliberate silences? That the gaps in our genealogies aren't accidents of time but acts of violence? I don't have a comfortable answer. But I know what we can't do. We can't pretend the official record is complete. We can't trust that everyone who existed was counted. We can't assume that absence of evidence is evidence of absence. The families of Alder Run are still here. Their descendants are sitting in homes right now, looking at family trees with inexplicable gaps, feeling a persistent wrongness they can't articulate. They're told they're bad at research, that they're not looking hard enough, that their ancestors must have moved somewhere and the records were lost. But the records weren't lost. They were never created. And that distinction matters because it changes the question from, where did they go, to, who decided they didn't count? I've started a project to reconstruct the missing census. Using company records, store ledgers, church registries, personal letters, and anything else I can find, I'm building a shadow document, a record of everyone who should have been counted in 1930 but wasn't. It's slow work, Many of the sources have been destroyed. Many families don't want to talk about it. There's shame attached to being erased, even when you did nothing wrong. But name by name, family by family, we're rebuilding what was taken. Not for official recognition. The government will never acknowledge this. But for the descendants who deserve to know their people existed. Who deserve to know their family fought back. Who deserve to know that silence was imposed, not chosen. Thomas Harlan and his family. I still don't know what happened to them after they were removed from Alder Run. I've searched every record I can find, and they vanished completely after November 1929. Maybe they changed their names. Maybe they died anonymously in another town. Maybe they're buried in an unmarked grave somewhere like so many others. But I know they existed. I know they mattered. I know their 5 children deserve to grow up in a world that acknowledged their humanity. And I know that every person watching this has ancestors who faced similar erasures, similar violences, similar decisions by people in power that they weren't worth the ink it took to record their names. The whispers in the census records aren't really whispers, they're screams. Screams that were muffled by bureaucracy and corporate power and the quiet complicity of people who knew better but looked away. And if we listen carefully, if we're willing to sit with the discomfort of knowing how thoroughly our history has been manipulated, we can still hear them. The missing names of Alder Run are calling out across a century. They're saying we were here. We mattered. Don't let them erase us twice by forgetting we ever existed. Remember us, even if the official record won't.